Welcome to Silent Shadows, a gripping tale of suspense, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Sarah Lawson is an ordinary hotel maid whose life takes a terrifying turn when she overhears a chilling conversation. A plot to murder one of the city's wealthiest businessmen, Jack Edwards. What begins as a desperate attempt to save a life soon spirals into a web of corruption, secrets, and danger that Sarah never could have imagined. With powerful enemies closing in, Sarah uncovers dark truths about her own past, forcing her to face unimaginable choices. Will she find the strength to expose the killers? And can she unravel the twisted secrets that link her to a dangerous family empire before it's too late? Stay tuned to find out, and if you're as hooked as I am, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below with your theories about what happens next. Let's dive into the thrilling world of Silent Shadows. Sarah Lawson pressed her hands against the cool, smooth surface of the marble countertop, the familiar scent of cleaning products swirling around her. She had been a maid at the luxurious Midtown Grand Hotel for over 3 years, scrubbing rooms that cost more per night than she made in a month. The crystal chandeliers sparkled high above her, casting flickers of light onto the polished floors. But to Sarah, it was all background noise. The guests never saw her. They never saw the woman who wiped down their sinks, who vacuumed their carpets, who silently passed through their lives without leaving a trace. Sarah was invisible, and she had come to accept that it wasn't the life she had envisioned growing up, but it was the life she had now. Her mother was sick, and the bills for medical treatments piled up higher each month. Sarah worked double shifts, cleaning rooms by day and wiping tables in the hotel restaurant by night. Sometimes she felt like she was drowning in the monotony of it all, but there was no other choice. The world didn't care about people like her. As she finished scrubbing the bathroom mirror, Sarah glanced at her reflection, worn and tired, with shadows under her eyes. She sighed and picked up her bucket of cleaning supplies. It was time to move on to the next room. Room 1805. A suite that belonged to Jack Edwards, a businessman who seemed to live at the hotel. He was always coming and going, surrounded by assistants and important-looking people. She had never spoken to him directly, but his name was all over the city. He owned half of it, from what Sarah could gather. She knocked softly on the door, more out of habit than necessity. Guests rarely answered when she knocked. "Housekeeping," she called out before slipping the key card into the slot. The green light blinked, and she pushed open the door. The room was silent, empty. Mr. Edwards was always out during the day, probably at some important meeting, discussing deals worth more than she could imagine. Sarah set her supplies down and began her routine, dusting the nightstands, straightening the bed, and vacuuming the floor. It was another day, another room, another few dollars toward her growing stack of bills. The dull hum of the vacuum filled the room as Sarah moved back and forth across the plush carpet, lost in her thoughts. But as she reached the edge of the room near the adjoining suite, something made her stop. Voices, muffled but clear enough to make out. She turned off the vacuum, her hand trembling slightly as she realized she had walked in on a conversation from the next room. Her instinct told her to leave, to keep cleaning, pretend she hadn't heard anything. But something about the tone of the voices gave her pause. One of them was a woman's voice, sharp and full of contempt. Sarah recognized it immediately as Rebecca Edwards, Jack's wife. She had only seen Rebecca in passing, always impeccably dressed, with an air of cold elegance. The other voice was a man's, low and rough. Sarah didn't recognize it, but the words he spoke sent a chill down her spine. "He'll never see it coming," Rebecca said, her voice dripping with malice. "It'll be over before he knows it." Sarah's pulse quickened. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't a casual conversation. This was something else, something terrible. The man responded, his voice dark and calculating. "We'll make sure the trip is the last one he ever takes. There won't be any loose ends." Sarah's hands tightened around the vacuum handle. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Were they talking about Jack? Were they planning to kill him? Her body screamed for her to leave, to forget what she had heard and walk away, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. She leaned closer to the door, her breath shallow, straining to hear more. Rebecca's voice cut through the air again. "We need to be careful. One mistake and it's all over." The man, Tom Nelson, Sarah later learned, grunted in agreement. "Don't worry. Everything is in place. When he's gone, we're free." Sarah's blood ran cold. They were talking about killing Jack Edwards. His own wife was plotting his murder with a man she called Tom. The weight of what she had just overheard pressed down on her like a stone. She backed away from the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What was she supposed to do? If she told anyone, who would believe her? She was just a maid. Rebecca was powerful, rich. People like her didn't get caught, and people like Sarah didn't matter. By the time Sarah finished cleaning the suite, her hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold the rag. She scrubbed the same spot on the counter over and over again, trying to block out the words that kept echoing in her mind. They were going to kill him. Rebecca and Tom were planning Jack's murder, and no one knew but her. What was she supposed to do? The logical answer was clear. She had to tell someone. But the thought of going to the police terrified her. Rebecca Edwards was powerful, well-connected. She could make Sarah's life disappear as easily as one would swat a fly. And even if Sarah did tell someone, who would believe her? A lowly maid claiming that the wife of one of the wealthiest men in the city was plotting his murder? She could see it now. The laughter, the dismissal. "She's just the help," they'd say. "She doesn't know what she's talking about." Still, she couldn't just do nothing. Could she? Sarah left the suite, the door closing softly behind her, and wandered aimlessly down the hall. Her mind was spinning, and every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to pretend she hadn't heard anything. But that nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach refused to go away. Jack Edwards wasn't a good man. He was arrogant, dismissive of people like her. But did that mean he deserved to die? By the time Sarah reached the lobby, her decision had been made. She couldn't let someone be murdered, even if it meant risking everything. She had to find a way to warn Jack, and she had to do it before it was too late. The next morning, Sarah stood nervously by the entrance to the hotel lobby, waiting for Jack Edwards to arrive. Her heart pounded in her chest as she rehearsed what she was going to say. What if he didn't believe her? What if he thought she was crazy? What if Rebecca found out? She wiped her sweaty palms on her apron and forced herself to stay calm. This was her one chance. She had to take it. When Jack finally walked into the lobby, surrounded by his usual entourage, Sarah's throat tightened. He looked every bit the part of the wealthy businessman, confident, in control, and far too busy to listen to someone like her. But she couldn't back down now. She had to try. "Mr. Edwards," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. He stopped, turning to look at her with a raised eyebrow. His eyes scanned her up and down, clearly unimpressed. "Yes?" he asked, his voice clipped. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. You shouldn't go on your trip tomorrow." Jack's expression shifted, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Excuse me?" "I overheard something," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a plan. Your wife. It's not safe for you to go." For a long moment Jack stared at her, his brow furrowed. He glanced at her name tag, as if trying to place her in the context of his busy life. A maid. That was all she was to him. "And why should I trust you?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Sarah's stomach dropped. He didn't believe her. Why would he? She was just a maid, invisible, insignificant. She had no proof, no way to back up her claim. But she had done everything she could. She had warned him. "I'm just trying to help," Sarah whispered, feeling the weight of her fear pressing down on her. Jack stood there for a moment longer, his gaze searching her face, before he finally turned away. "I'll think about it," he said over his shoulder, dismissive as ever. And then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd of hotel guests and assistants. Sarah stood frozen, watching him disappear, her heart sinking. That was it. She had warned him, and now it was out of her hands. As Sarah made her way back to the staff quarters, the feeling of dread settled heavily over her. She had done everything she could, but the fear that Rebecca and Tom would follow through with their plan gnawed at her. What if Jack didn't take her seriously? What if they went through with it anyway? The weight of what she had overheard felt heavier than ever. Sarah woke up the next morning feeling uneasy. The events of the previous day haunted her. She had warned Jack Edwards, but would he listen? What if Rebecca and Tom followed through with their plan, and her warning wasn't enough? As Sarah walked to the hotel for another shift, she was greeted by the usual hustle and bustle of the city. People rushed past her, unaware of the secrets she carried, unaware of the weight pressing down on her chest. She thought about turning back, but then she saw the headline on a newsstand by the entrance. Business tycoon Jack Edwards cancels high-stakes trip. Last minute. The article mentioned Edwards calling off his trip abruptly, citing unforeseen circumstances. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. He'd listened. Jack had actually taken her warning seriously. For a moment, relief washed over her. Maybe things would be okay. Maybe the worst had been avoided. But as Sarah entered the hotel, a new kind of dread settled in. Rebecca and Tom wouldn't just give up. If they knew she had intervened, they might come after her next. She glanced around the lobby, feeling more vulnerable than ever. She had tried to help, but had she made herself a target in the process? The following days blurred together. Sarah kept her head down, doing her job as if nothing had changed. But the sense of being watched never left her. At first she tried to brush it off as paranoia, the aftershocks of overhearing something dangerous. But then the strange incident started, a shadow lingering just outside her apartment window at night. The feeling of someone following her on her walk home. A cryptic note slipped under her door that read, "You should have kept quiet." Sarah's blood ran cold when she found the note. She knew without a doubt it was connected to Rebecca and Tom. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Running would only make her more suspicious. She had to be smart about this. She kept working at the hotel, but every time she passed by room 1805, she felt her heart race. She avoided looking directly at the Edwards suite, afraid that Rebecca might be watching her, knowing full well that Sarah was the one who had ruined their plan. At night, Sarah barricaded her door with a chair, double-checking the locks. Sleep became difficult, every creak of her apartment building sending a jolt of fear through her. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, convinced that someone was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, after an exhausting double shift, Sarah decided to visit her mother at the hospital. Her mother, frail and bedridden, was Sarah's only family, and the one person who brought her comfort. As Sarah sat by her bedside, her mother looked at her with concern. "You look tired, sweetheart," her mother said weakly. "Are you okay?" Sarah smiled, though the fear inside her was hard to hide. "I'm fine, Mom. Just work's been rough." Her mother didn't ask further. She never did. She had her own battles to fight. But as Sarah left the hospital that night, the sinking feeling returned. The city lights flickered above her as she walked down the darkened street, each shadow feeling more menacing than the last. She pulled her coat tighter around her and quickened her pace. Something wasn't right. She could feel it. And then she saw it. Out of the corner of her eye, a figure moving silently in the darkness behind her. Sarah's heart raced as she broke into a run. Panting and gasping for breath, Sarah finally reached the safety of her apartment, her mind spinning with fear. She slammed the door behind her, locking it quickly. Was it Tom? Had he been the one following her? She didn't know. But as the adrenaline wore off, Sarah realized that she couldn't keep living like this. Afraid, paranoid, always looking over her shoulder. She needed help. The next morning, Sarah made the decision to go to Jack Edwards. He was the only one who knew about the warning, and if anyone had the power to protect her, it was him. She arrived at his office building, her nerves frazzled but her mind made up. Jack greeted her in a private conference room, his face drawn with tension. "I thought I'd be hearing from you soon," he said, offering her a seat. Sarah sat down, her hands shaking. "They know, Jack. They know I warned you. They've been following me." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I suspected as much." "What are we going to do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "They'll come after me." Jack's face grew serious. "There's something you need to know, Sarah. Rebecca, she's not just after me for the money. This goes deeper than you think." Sarah frowned, confused. "Deeper? What are you talking about?" Jack leaned forward, his voice low. "Rebecca's been involved in more than just planning my murder. She's been embezzling money from my company for years. And it gets worse. Your father, Sarah, was part of this. He was framed by Rebecca's father a long time ago. That's why you never knew what really happened to him. Sarah froze, her mind reeling. My father? Her voice wavered. What do you mean? Jack nodded grimly. Your father worked for a company that was tied to Rebecca's family. He found out about their illegal dealings and tried to expose them. But they silenced him before he could. They made his death look like an accident. Sarah's world spun. Her father, who had died when she was just a child, had been murdered by the same people now trying to kill Jack. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless and shaken. They framed him, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. And now, they're after me. Jack's eyes softened with sympathy. That's why they won't stop. Rebecca knows you're a threat. You know too much now. Sarah's heart raced with both fear and anger. She had lived her entire life in the shadows of other people's power, never knowing the truth about her own father's death. And now, she was caught in the same dangerous web. What do we do? She asked, her voice small. Jack leaned back, his expression hardening. We expose them, all of them. I've been working with someone, Detective Mark Harris. He's been investigating Rebecca for months. If we can get enough evidence, we can bring her and Tom down. Later that evening, Sarah met Jack and Detective Mark Harris in a quiet coffee shop away from the hotel. Mark was a gruff, no-nonsense kind of man, with a look of exhaustion that came from years of dealing with the worst kinds of people. He listened carefully as Sarah explained what had happened, his sharp eyes never leaving her face. You're in deep, Mark said finally, leaning back in his chair. But we might have a shot at bringing them down. We just need more evidence. Proof of their involvement in the fraud and the murder plot. Sarah nodded, still processing everything. How do we get that proof? Mark glanced at Jack before answering. Rebecca's kept records, financial documents, phone logs, everything. It's all in a secure location. Her family's estate. If we can get our hands on those files, we'll have what we need to bring her to justice. But it's risky, Jack added. Going after those files means entering dangerous territory. If Rebecca catches wind of what we're doing, she won't hesitate to come after you. Sarah's stomach churned with nerves, but there was no backing out now. She couldn't run, not after learning the truth about her father. She had to see this through. The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. Sarah, Jack, and Mark spent hours going over every detail of Rebecca's estate, where the files were kept, how to access them, how to get in and out without being detected. Mark pulled in favors with some of his contacts, gathering as much intel as possible. Sarah felt the weight of the danger growing with every passing hour. She had never been involved in something like this before, something so real, so terrifying. But she couldn't let fear stop her. Not now. Late one night, after a long day of planning, Sarah found herself alone in her apartment, staring at the few possessions she owned. Her life had always been small, contained. She had never imagined that she would be wrapped up in something this big, this dangerous. She thought of her father, of the life he had lived, and how everything had been taken from him. She wouldn't let that happen to her. She wouldn't let Rebecca win. The night before the planned break-in, Sarah couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, her mind racing with what-ifs. But just as she was starting to drift off, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Jack. We've been betrayed. Paul's working for Rebecca. Sarah sat up, her heart racing. Paul, Jack's trusted assistant, had been feeding information to Rebecca and Tom the whole time. The plan was compromised. She quickly dressed and rushed to meet Jack. When she arrived at his office, she found him pacing, his face pale with anger and fear. He sold us out, Jack said, running a hand through his hair. Rebecca knows everything. We can't trust anyone. Sarah's mind whirled. The danger was closer than ever. If Rebecca knew what they were planning, she wouldn't just come after Jack. She would come after Sarah, too. What do we do now? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Jack took a deep breath, his jaw clenched. We don't stop. We go after those files. But we have to move fast, before she has time to cover her tracks. Sarah's heart pounded as she left Jack's office, her mind a storm of fear and confusion. Paul's betrayal had rattled her to the core. They were now racing against the clock, and she could feel the walls closing in. Rebecca wasn't just dangerous. She was ruthless, willing to do anything to protect herself. If Paul had been feeding her information, then everything Sarah had done, every move she'd made, was likely known to Rebecca. The night air was cold as Sarah made her way back to her apartment, her footsteps echoing eerily on the empty streets. She tried to shake the paranoia that had been growing over the past few days, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Every shadow seemed to move. Every noise felt amplified. Her chest tightened as she picked up her pace, eyes darting nervously toward every dark alley she passed. Suddenly she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. They were faint, but steady. Someone was following her. Sarah's pulse quickened. She forced herself not to look back, knowing it would only confirm her fear. Instead, she moved faster, her heart pounding in her ears as the footsteps quickened too. She was almost running now, her breaths coming in short gasps as she rounded the corner, praying that she could make it to her building in time. But the footsteps were getting closer. Desperation fueled her as she broke into a sprint, racing up the steps to her apartment building. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The footsteps were right behind her now. She could feel it. Finally, she managed to unlock the door and slip inside, slamming it shut behind her and throwing the deadbolt into place. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed her back against the door, her heart racing in her chest. She listened, straining to hear outside the door. Nothing. Whoever had been following her was gone. But the fear lingered. Sarah knew this wasn't over. Rebecca's men were watching her. They were waiting for the right moment to strike. And when they did, there would be no escaping them. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Every creak of her apartment building, every distant sound from the street below made her jump. She sat in the corner of her small living room, clutching her phone, staring at the clock as the minutes dragged on. She couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in a cycle of fear, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for Rebecca to make her move. By morning, Sarah had made up her mind. She had to run. She couldn't stay here, knowing that her life was in constant danger. Rebecca and Tom wouldn't stop until they silenced her, just like they had silenced her father. She quickly packed a small bag, shoving in only the essentials. She didn't have much to begin with. Just a few clothes, her phone, and a small stack of cash she had been saving up for emergencies. This was it. She was leaving everything behind. Sarah stood by the door, her hand resting on the knob as she hesitated for just a moment. Could she really run? Was this the only way? She thought of Jack, of the danger he was still in, of the files they needed to retrieve from Rebecca's estate. If she ran now, would she be abandoning him? Her stomach churned with guilt, but she pushed the thought aside. Jack was smart. He had resources. He would find another way. She had to think about her own survival. As she stepped out into the hallway, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the message. It was from Detective Mark Harris. "Don't leave. We're too close." Sarah stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. She felt a surge of frustration and fear. They were close, yes, but at what cost? Her life? She was in too deep, and every instinct told her to run, to get as far away from Rebecca as possible. But something about Mark's message made her pause. Could they really be that close to bringing Rebecca down? She hesitated, torn between the overwhelming urge to flee and the lingering hope that maybe, just maybe, they could stop Rebecca for good. In the end, Sarah made her choice. Sarah returned to Jack's office the following morning, exhausted but determined. She hadn't slept, and the weight of everything that had happened hung heavily on her shoulders. But the moment she saw Jack, she knew she couldn't abandon him. Not now, not after everything they had been through. "Why didn't you tell me about my father sooner?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know all the details until recently. I wasn't sure how much of it was true. But after what happened, I couldn't keep it from you." Sarah swallowed hard, trying to process the enormity of what he had told her. Her father hadn't just been an innocent man caught in the crossfire. He had been targeted, framed and murdered by the same family that was now trying to kill her. "My whole life," Sarah's voice cracked, "I thought his death was an accident. I thought it was just bad luck." Jack's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I know how hard this must be for you. But I promise, we're going to get justice for your father." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't break down now. There was too much at stake. "Rebecca can't get away with this," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the pain in her chest. "We have to stop her." Jack nodded. "We will, but we have to be smart about this. We're running out of time." They spent the next few hours going over their plan in detail. Jack had arranged for Mark to help them infiltrate Rebecca's family estate, where they believed the files containing the proof they needed were hidden. It was a risky operation, but it was their only chance. As the hours passed, Sarah felt a sense of resolve growing within her. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to hide. This was her fight now, too. The night of the planned break-in arrived, and Sarah's nerves were on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far. Jack and Mark met her outside the hotel, their faces grim as they went over the final details. Sarah's heart pounded as they approached the car, her stomach twisting with anxiety. She had never done anything like this before, breaking into a heavily guarded estate, risking her life for the chance to retrieve a few pieces of paper. But those pieces of paper were the key to everything. They were the proof that could bring Rebecca down. As they drove through the darkened streets, Sarah tried to steady her breathing, but the fear was overwhelming. Her hands trembled in her lap, and she kept glancing nervously out the window, half expecting Rebecca's men to appear at any moment. Mark glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You doing okay?" Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was lying to him or to herself. "Yeah, just nervous." Jack gave her a reassuring look from the front seat. "We'll be in and out before they even know we're there." But Sarah wasn't so sure. The estate was heavily guarded, and Rebecca was smart, smarter than any of them had given her credit for. She would be expecting something like this. As they pulled up to the estate, Sarah's heart sank. The place was even more imposing than she had imagined. The tall iron gates loomed ahead, surrounded by thick stone walls. Beyond them, the dark silhouette of the mansion loomed in the distance, its windows dark and foreboding. Mark cut the engine and the three of them sat in tense silence for a moment, staring at the gates. "This is it," Jack said quietly, his voice barely audible in the still night air. Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath as she opened the car door. Her legs felt shaky as she stepped onto the gravel driveway, the cold night air biting at her skin. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, glancing nervously at the estate ahead. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as they approached the gates. Mark had managed to disable the security cameras earlier in the day, but that didn't mean they were safe. There were still guards patrolling the grounds, and if they were caught, there would be no escape. As they reached the gate, Mark pulled out a small set of tools and began working on the lock. Sarah's heart raced as she stood guard, her eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. Every second felt like an eternity, and the silence was deafening. Finally, with a soft click, the gate swung open. They slipped inside, moving silently across the lawn as they made their way toward the mansion. The tension was unbearable, and Sarah's nerves were frayed, every shadow feeling like a threat. When they reached the back door, Mark quickly picked the lock, and they slipped inside, the cold, musty air of the mansion surrounding them. The house was eerily silent, the only sound their own footsteps echoing softly in the empty halls. "This way," Jack whispered, leading them toward the study where the files were supposedly hidden. But just as they reached the study door, a voice rang out from the darkness. "Well, well," a cold voice said. "What do we have here?" Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice as Rebecca stepped out from the shadows, a cruel smile curling on her lips. The silence that followed Rebecca's words felt like a crushing weight. Sarah's heart pounded as she stared into the cold, calculating eyes of the woman who had orchestrated so much pain in her life. Rebecca Edwards stood before them, flanked by Tom Nelson, who was as menacing as ever. The door behind them clicked shut, sealing them in the room. "Well, this was a surprise," Rebecca said, her voice laced with mock amusement. She paced slowly, each step deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. "I had a feeling you'd try something, but I didn't expect you to bring her along." Her eyes flicked toward Sarah, a smile tugging at her lips. Sarah clenched her fists, her fear mixing with anger. This woman had ruined her life, taken her father, and now planned to destroy Jack. But Sarah wasn't the same scared maid she had been when she overheard their plans. She had come too far to let Rebecca win. Jack stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "It's over, Rebecca. We know everything. We have proof. Documents that will bring you down." Rebecca's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction. "Proof?" She tilted her head slightly. "You think a few pieces of paper will stop me? Do you know how long my family has been in this game, Jack? Longer than you've been alive. You don't destroy an empire like mine with a few files." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She could see the confidence in Rebecca's eyes, the certainty that she still had the upper hand. But Sarah knew something Rebecca didn't. Sarah wasn't going to back down. Rebecca's voice cut through the tension again. "I was going to handle this quietly, you know? Make it all go away, like I've done before. But now I have to make an example out of you." She turned to Tom, her voice low and sharp. "Do it." Tom's hand moved toward his jacket, where Sarah knew a gun was hidden. Panic flared inside her. There was no way out, no escape. But she couldn't let it end like this. Not after everything. "Wait!" Sarah's voice cut through the air, surprising even herself. She stepped forward, meeting Rebecca's gaze head-on. "You don't have to do this. You think killing us will solve your problems, but it won't. People know. The police know. Detective Harris knows." Rebecca's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Detective Harris?" she repeated, suspicion flickering across her face. Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She had to keep talking, to buy them time. "He's been investigating you for months. He already has enough to bring you down. But these files—" She glanced at Jack, hoping he would catch on. "They'll seal your fate. You're running out of options, Rebecca." Rebecca's jaw clenched, her calm demeanor slipping for the first time. She shot a glance at Tom, who had paused, his hand hovering near his gun. For a moment the room was filled with a tense, suffocating silence. Sarah could see the doubt creeping into Rebecca's eyes. She was losing control of the situation. "I'm not afraid of the police," Rebecca said, though her voice wavered ever so slightly. "I have connections. You think you can just waltz out of here and go to the authorities? They'll never believe you." Sarah took a step closer, her heart racing but her resolve stronger than ever. "They don't need to believe me. They'll believe the evidence. And once this all comes out, your name, your reputation, your family, everything you've built will be destroyed." Rebecca's eyes flashed with fury, but Sarah didn't flinch. She had already lost so much. She wasn't going to let fear stop her now. The tension in the room was thick, the air charged with the possibility of violence. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears, but she kept her gaze steady, locked on Rebecca's. She couldn't let her see the fear. She couldn't let her know how terrified she was. Rebecca's eyes darted between Sarah, Jack, and Tom. Sarah could see the calculation happening in her mind. Rebecca was trying to weigh her options, trying to decide if she could still control this situation. But Sarah knew the truth. Rebecca had already lost control. Finally, Rebecca let out a bitter laugh. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she sneered. "You think you can beat me?" Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. We have the files. The police are already on their way." Rebecca's eyes flickered with something dark. Panic, perhaps, but it was quickly masked by her usual cold arrogance. She straightened her posture, a smirk forming on her lips. "If the police are coming, then we're all out of time, aren't we?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she realized what Rebecca meant. There was no way Rebecca would go down without a fight. She would make this ugly. Her hands trembled as she glanced at Jack, the fear clawing its way back up her throat. She needed to stay calm, to think clearly, but her mind was spinning. Suddenly Tom moved. In one swift motion, he pulled out his gun and pointed it at Jack. "Don't move," he snarled, his finger hovering over the trigger. Panic surged through Sarah. This was it. This was how it would end. But before Tom could react, the door behind them burst open with a loud crash. Sarah whipped around to see Detective Mark Harris and a team of officers storming into the room, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon!" Mark shouted, his voice booming in the small room. For a moment, Everything seemed to freeze. Tom's gun wavered in the air, and Rebecca's face twisted with shock and fury. But the moment passed, and Tom slowly lowered his weapon, his eyes flicking nervously between Mark and Rebecca. "It's over, Rebecca," Mark said, his voice cold and final. "We have everything we need." Rebecca's face contorted with rage. "You think this will stop me?" she spat. "You think this is the end?" Mark stepped forward, his gun still trained on Tom. "Yes," he said simply. "It's over." The relief that flooded Sarah was almost overwhelming. She sank to the floor, her legs shaking beneath her as the reality of what had just happened settled over her. It was over. The files were safe. Rebecca was finished. The police quickly took Rebecca and Tom into custody, their protests drowned out by the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. Sarah watched as Rebecca was led away, her once powerful figure now reduced to a seething, defeated woman. But as the door closed behind her, Sarah couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. They had won, yes, but at what cost? Her life had been turned upside down, her world shattered by the secrets she had uncovered. She had lost her father, nearly lost her own life, and now, even with Rebecca behind bars, it didn't feel like victory. Jack knelt beside her, his expression soft with concern. "You okay?" Sarah nodded, though her body still trembled. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice weak. "I think so." Jack helped her to her feet, his hand steady and reassuring. "It's over," he said gently. "You did it, Sarah. You helped bring her down." Sarah managed a weak smile, but her mind was far away. The files had been secured, the evidence gathered. Rebecca would face justice for her crimes, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. As the police finished clearing the scene, Sarah and Jack were escorted out of the mansion and into the waiting police cars. The cool night air hit her like a shock, but it was a relief to be outside, away from the darkness of the mansion. As she sat in the back of the police car, staring out at the stars, Sarah's thoughts drifted back to her father. She wondered if he would be proud of her, if he would understand the choices she had made. She had fought for justice, for the truth, but it had come at a high price. The life she had known was gone, replaced by something far more complicated. "Hey," Jack said from the seat beside her, his voice soft. "You did the right thing." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Did I?" Jack nodded. "You stood up to someone who had destroyed lives for years. You gave your father the justice he deserved." Sarah's throat tightened as she blinked back tears. It was over. The fight was over, but she wasn't sure if she could ever truly escape the shadows of what had happened. The car began to pull away from the mansion, the lights of the estate fading into the distance. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she could find peace. Maybe she could finally start over. As they drove into the night, Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself to breathe. The battle had been won, and now it was time to rebuild. The next morning felt surreal. After the night's events, Sarah awoke in a daze, her body exhausted but her mind still racing. Despite Rebecca's arrest and Tom's capture, a nagging feeling of unease lingered in her chest. She should have felt relieved. It was over. At least it should have been. But the uneasy knot in her stomach told her something wasn't right. She dressed quickly, unable to shake the feeling that there was unfinished business. A part of her wanted to move on, to put this nightmare behind her. But the more she tried to convince herself, the more her instincts screamed that it wasn't over yet. Sarah's phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a text from Jack. "We need to meet. Something's wrong. I'm outside your building." Her heart skipped a beat. She grabbed her coat and rushed out of her apartment, barely pausing to lock the door behind her. When she stepped onto the street, she saw Jack leaning against his car, looking tense and troubled. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her hands were trembling. Jack's expression was grim as he pushed off the car and met her halfway. "There's been a development," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "It's Rebecca. She's already been released on bail." Sarah's heart sank. "What? How is that even possible?" "The charges—" "I know," Jack interrupted, his voice tight with frustration. "She has connections. Powerful ones. Her lawyers are working overtime, and there are rumors that they might be trying to make some of the evidence disappear. Sarah's mind reeled. Disappear? But we have the files. We have proof. Jack shook his head. It might not be enough. If Rebecca can bribe the right people, pull the right strings. She's not done, Sarah. She'll find a way to come after us. A cold fear gripped Sarah's chest. She had believed, for one brief moment, that this nightmare was over. But Rebecca was a different kind of enemy. One who played by her own rules, using her wealth and influence to manipulate the system. So what do we do now? Sarah asked, feeling the dread creeping back into her bones. Jack looked her in the eye, his expression serious. We don't wait for her to strike first. We go after her. We find more evidence, something she can't bury or erase. Sarah's stomach twisted. But how? We've already turned over everything we found. Jack hesitated, then lowered his voice. There's one more place. Rebecca's father's old estate. She's been using it to store things. Hidden accounts, illegal documents, things she never wanted anyone to find. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. This could be their chance. If they could get to that estate and find the missing evidence, they might finally be able to take Rebecca down for good. But it wouldn't be easy. We have to be careful, Jack said. Rebecca's not going to sit back and let us come after her again. She knows what's at stake. She'll fight back. Sarah swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She had already risked so much. But if Rebecca was still out there, if she still had the power to destroy lives, Sarah couldn't walk away. I'm in, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Let's end this. The drive to Rebecca's father's estate was tense, the silence between Sarah and Jack thick with anticipation. The estate was farther out than Rebecca's own mansion, secluded in a quiet rural area where few people ventured. The isolation made it the perfect place to hide the kind of incriminating evidence they needed. As they pulled up to the estate, Sarah's nerves were on edge. The large crumbling stone walls and iron gates gave the place an eerie, abandoned feel. But Sarah knew better. Rebecca's reach extended even here, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Mark had been unable to join them. He was tied up with legal battles surrounding the first wave of charges against Rebecca. But he had provided them with as much information as he could. There were no security cameras this time, no guards patrolling the grounds. Rebecca hadn't expected anyone to know about this place, but Sarah knew better than to underestimate her. Jack parked the car a short distance away, and they made their way toward the gates. Sarah's heart raced with every step, the fear of being discovered looming over her. They slipped inside the estate, moving quickly through the overgrown courtyard toward the main house. It wasn't long before they found the study. The room was dimly lit, and dust covered the furniture, as though no one had been there in years. But Jack knew where to look. He pulled aside a bookshelf, revealing a hidden panel in the wall. "This is it," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. Sarah's pulse quickened as Jack began working on the lock. They were so close now. All they needed was one more piece of evidence, one more damning document that could seal Rebecca's fate. But just as the lock clicked open, a familiar voice echoed from the doorway. "I knew you'd come back." Sarah's blood ran cold as she turned to see Rebecca standing in the doorway, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of amusement and fury. She looked poised and calm, as though she had been expecting this all along. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Rebecca said, stepping into the room. "You really thought you could take me down with a few old files?" Jack stepped in front of Sarah, his jaw clenched. "It's over, Rebecca. We have everything we need." Rebecca's smile widened, her eyes dark with malice. "Oh, Jack," she purred, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're so naive. You think you can win?" "I've already made sure this little operation of yours goes nowhere. The right people are on my side." Sarah's heart raced. This was it, the final showdown. Rebecca wasn't going down without a fight, and Sarah knew that things could get ugly fast. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. "We're not afraid of you," Sarah said, stepping out from behind Jack. "You can't silence us." Rebecca's smile faltered for the briefest moment, and Sarah saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. But then Rebecca's gaze hardened. "You've made a big mistake," Rebecca said coldly, "and people like you don't get to walk away from mistakes like this." Sarah braced herself, ready for the inevitable. Rebecca's threat hung in the air, a palpable danger that made Sarah's skin crawl. But just as the tension reached its breaking point, the door behind Rebecca burst open. A team of officers stormed into the room, led by none other than Detective Mark Harris. "Rebecca Edwards," Mark's voice boomed. "You're under arrest." Rebecca spun around, her eyes wide with shock as the officers moved in, guns drawn. For the first time, Sarah saw true fear on Rebecca's face. The confidence, the arrogance, it all crumbled in an instant. "You think this will stop me?" Rebecca hissed, backing away as the officers closed in. "I'm untouchable." But Mark wasn't fazed. He stepped forward, his expression calm and unyielding. "It's over, Rebecca. You've lost." The officers moved quickly, handcuffing Rebecca and leading her out of the room. She struggled, shouting curses and threats, but it was clear to everyone in the room that her reign of terror was finally at an end. As Rebecca was escorted out, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was over, this time for real. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring smile. "We did it." Sarah nodded, though the enormity of what had just happened hadn't fully sunk in yet. They had won. They had taken down one of the most dangerous people she had ever known. But the cost had been high. She had risked everything, her life, her safety. And now, standing in the quiet of the study, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of exhaustion. The battle was over, but the emotional toll it had taken on her was overwhelming. The days that followed felt like a blur. The news of Rebecca Edwards' arrest spread quickly, making headlines across the city. The files that Sarah and Jack had retrieved from the estate were enough to bring charges not just against Rebecca, but against several other powerful figures involved in her schemes. Sarah watched from the sidelines as the legal system took over. She gave her testimony, handed over the evidence, and let the professionals do the rest. It was a relief to no longer be in the center of the storm, but it also left her feeling strangely empty. She had spent so long fighting for justice, for the truth, for her life. Now that the fight was over, she didn't know what came next. One afternoon, as she sat in her new apartment, a modest but comfortable space far removed from the luxury of the Midtown Grand Hotel, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. She had lost so much, but she had also gained something she never expected: a sense of strength, of resilience. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Jack. "Dinner tonight?" To celebrate the end of the madness, Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. The battle was over, but the future was wide open. She wasn't sure what it held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. She grabbed her coat and headed for the door, a sense of peace settling over her. The past had been dark and full of shadows, but now she was stepping into the light. The courtroom was packed. Sarah sat quietly in the back, watching as the trial against Rebecca Edwards unfolded before her eyes. Weeks had passed since that final confrontation at the estate, and while Rebecca's arrogance had remained intact, her resources had not. The evidence Sarah and Jack had gathered had become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, with Detective Mark Harris leading the charge to ensure that justice was served. As witness after witness testified, the weight of Rebecca's crimes became impossible to deny. Her family's corruption, the embezzlement, the attempted murder plots, it was all laid bare for the world to see. And now, the city that had once feared her was watching her fall. Rebecca sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her expression cold and unyielding. But there was a flicker of defeat in her eyes, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that this time she couldn't escape what was coming. Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions as she watched it all play out. Relief, certainly, but also sadness. She had won. Rebecca was going to prison for the rest of her life, but the cost had been high. Sarah had been pulled into a world of danger and deceit that had forever changed her. She had lost her sense of security, her innocence. She had learned the hard way that justice, even when served, didn't erase the scars left behind. The closing arguments were delivered, the jury deliberated, and then the verdict came. It felt almost surreal when the judge read out the words Sarah had been waiting to hear. Guilty on all counts. The room erupted in murmurs, but Sarah barely registered them. A quiet sense of closure washed over her, Not the triumphant victory she had once imagined, but a softer, more bittersweet relief. It was over. Rebecca Edwards was finished. Jack found her in the hallway after the verdict was read. His eyes were full of compassion as he approached her. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. Sarah smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought I'd feel more, but it's just done." Jack nodded, understanding. "That's how it goes sometimes. You fight so hard for something, and when it's finally over, it doesn't always feel the way you expected." They stood there in silence for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation settle in. Sarah had never imagined herself in this position, a key player in taking down one of the city's most powerful families. But now that it was done, she didn't know what came next. Jack broke the silence. "You did the right thing, Sarah. You made sure your father's name was cleared, and you saved lives, mine included." Sarah met his gaze, grateful for his words, but still feeling that hollow space in her chest where the relief should have been. "I just want it all behind me," she said softly. "I want to start over." Jack's smile was gentle. "You will. You've earned it." Months passed, and life slowly began to settle into something resembling normalcy. The headlines about Rebecca's trial and sentencing faded into the background as the city moved on to the next big scandal. But for Sarah, the effects of the ordeal lingered. She had left her job at the Midtown Grand Hotel, no longer able to walk those familiar hallways without remembering the terror and uncertainty that had consumed her life. Instead, Sarah had found a new job at a small independent bookstore on the Lower East Side. It was quiet, peaceful, a far cry from the chaos of her former life, and exactly what she needed. She spent her days surrounded by the comforting smell of old books and the soft murmur of customers browsing the shelves. It was a place of solace, a world far removed from the one where she had once feared for her life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a warm golden glow over the city, Sarah sat on the small balcony of her new apartment. She had moved out of the luxurious space Jack had arranged for her and into a modest, cozy apartment of her own. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and for the first time in a long time she felt a sense of peace. As she sipped her tea and watched the lights of the city twinkle below, Sarah allowed herself to reflect on everything that had happened. The fear, the danger, the losses she had suffered. It was all behind her now. But in its place, she had found something unexpected. Strength. She had discovered that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. Her phone buzzed on the small table beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Jack. "How's the new place? Dinner this weekend?" Sarah smiled as she read the text. She and Jack had stayed in touch, meeting occasionally for coffee or dinner, but their relationship had settled into something more comfortable, more easygoing. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people who had been through something extraordinary together, now trying to figure out their next steps. "The place is great," she typed back. "And sure, let's do dinner." She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes and letting the cool evening breeze wash over her. The weight that had once pressed down on her chest had lifted, replaced by a quiet contentment. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time she wasn't afraid of it. The sound of laughter drifted up from the street below, mingling with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional honk of a taxi horn. The city was alive, full of stories yet to be told, and Sarah felt ready to face whatever came next. She thought about her father, about the truth she had uncovered, and the justice she had fought for. His memory no longer brought the sharp sting of grief it once had. Instead, there was a sense of peace, of closure. She had done what she could to honor him, and now it was time to honor herself. The sun dipped lower, the sky fading from gold to deep purple. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill her lungs, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, she was free. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through Silent Shadows. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more thrilling, suspenseful tales like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to share more exciting stories with you. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on Sarah's journey, and let me know what kind of story you'd love to see next. Stay tuned, and thanks for being part of the adventure.